On a grim July morning in 1540 inside the Tower of London, Thomas Cromwell stood on the scaffold. He wasn't there for betraying his king, but for a catastrophic political miscalculation. He had arranged a royal marriage, and the king found the bride unattractive. This is the story of Tudor England, an age of poets, explorers, and a law that could see you executed for a single incorrect thought. So how did a nation devolve from standard political maneuvering to making dissent a capital offense? How was an entire system engineered to punish not just actions, but the very act of thinking? It turns out the curse haunting the Tudors wasn't supernatural. It was man-made, written into parchment, and brutally efficient. It was called the Treason Act of 1534, and it turned every subject's mind into a potential crime scene. Before we begin the autopsy, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Subscribe to unlock the chamber and see how the machinery of paranoia was built piece by horrifying piece. Welcome back to Cursed Chambers. You don't notice the decay at first. It doesn't begin with a collapse of the entire structure, but with hairline fractures in the marble. To understand how a stray thought could become a capital crime, you must first dissect the society that made it possible. We must peel back the gilded layers of Tudor England and examine the slow rot that infested every level of the kingdom, from the halls of power to the privacy of the human mind. It begins, as it always does, with a sense of order. On the surface, the Tudor court operated with a brutal but understandable logic. The primary business of the 16th century monarchy was survival, and the primary tools for survival were heirs and alliances. This was the world of high politics, a chess game played across the map of Europe. The most powerful piece in this game was royal marriage. It was not a matter of the heart. It was an instrument of the state, a transaction of blood and power. When King Henry VIII, widowed and insecure, sought a new wife, his need was threefold: a male heir to secure his dynasty, a Protestant alliance to protect England from its Catholic enemies, and a queen to maintain the theater of majesty. The selection of a foreign princess like Anne of Cleves was not a personal choice. It was a move of grand strategy, a piece of foreign policy embodied in human form. The language used to describe these arrangements was sterile and professional, scrubbed clean of human emotion. Courtiers and diplomats spoke of strategic advantage, dynastic security, and the stability of the realm. These were not lies, they were the accepted truths of their time. The mechanism was clear: consolidate power, secure the succession, and build a bulwark against the hostile Catholic powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. From the detached perspective of a London council chamber, it all made perfect rational sense. But beneath this cold calculus, there was a human cost. A woman, Anne of Cleves, was evaluated, packaged, and shipped across the English Channel like a prized mare, her future determined by men she had never met. Her value was not in her character or intellect, but in her womb and her political connections. This level of dehumanization was the accepted foundational price of power. It was the normal state of affairs, the baseline of cruelty upon which the entire edifice of the Tudor state was built. This was the clean, polished surface, but just beneath it, the foundations were beginning to shift and crack. Beneath the manicured gardens of the royal palaces, the very ground of England was churning. The kingdom was experiencing what historians call progress. People were on the move, abandoning the feudal countryside for the promise of the cities. London's population swelled, its docks bustled with trade, and its streets teemed with newfound energy. On paper, it was a picture of a nation growing richer and more dynamic. But progress brought its own sickness. The language of courtiers was of urban growth and economic expansion. But the language of the streets was one of stench and survival. The medieval infrastructure of London was completely overwhelmed. Human and animal waste piled up in the narrow alleyways, turning them into open sewers. The Thames became a dumping ground for filth. In this new crowded world, disease was not an occasional visitor, it was a permanent resident. With filth came vermin. The city was overrun with rats, and with the rats came the desperate need for a solution. That solution was a simple, cheap, and terrifyingly effective white powder arsenic. Known as rat's bane, it quickly became a ubiquitous feature of the Tudor home. It was sold openly without regulation and stored in kitchen pantries, often in unmarked jars sitting right next to the flour, sugar, and salt. And so, the danger that was once confined to the battlefield or in the political arena now crept into the heart of the home. The human cost was measured in sudden, inexplicable deaths. A housewife preparing the family stew could reach for what she thought was flour and instead serve a spoonful of death. A child could mistake the sweet-tasting powder for sugar. The danger was no longer just the state, it was the world itself. This pervasive poison also offered a new convenient tool for those with malice in their hearts. The assassination of Sir Thomas Overbury in the Tower of London became a national scandal, revealing how easily arsenic could be used by the elite to settle scores in a quiet, untraceable manner. The physical world had become treacherous. Your own food could kill you. The sense of safety was eroding, replaced by a low hum of anxiety and suspicion. When the physical world grows toxic and unpredictable, the mind seeks refuge in institutions of trust medicine to heal the body and religion to save the soul. But in Tudor England, these pillars of society were themselves becoming engines of harm, riddled with a rot that spread from the inside out. The medicine of the day was a landscape of horrors. Guided by the ancient and deeply flawed theory of the four humors, physicians practiced what can only be called curious medicine, often with fatal results. A patient suffering from a fever was not comforted but subjected to treatments that compounded their misery. Doctors prescribed bloodletting opening veins to drain the very life force from a weakening body. They applied leeches and scorching cups to the skin, believing they could draw out the sickness. The language was of balancing and purging, but the reality was a systematic weakening of the sick, pushing them closer to the grave in the name of healing. The poison of the kitchen soon found its way into the physician's bag. Arsenic, the great destroyer, was also prescribed in small doses as a medicine. More horrifyingly, it became a key ingredient in cosmetics. In an age that prized pale skin as a mark of nobility, arsenic-laced powders and creams were used as skin whiteners. It was rumored that even Queen Elizabeth I herself used such concoctions, slowly poisoning her body for the sake of a royal complexion. Here the sickness reached a new level. People were now willingly applying poison to themselves, trusting the flawed wisdom of their institutions over the evidence of their own senses. But the most powerful institution of all, the church, was where the rot became a schism that tore the nation apart. Driven by his desperate need for a divorce, Henry VIII broke with Rome and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not merely a change in doctrine, it was a revolution that weaponized faith. Suddenly, your private beliefs about God were a matter of public allegiance to the king. The language shifted from salvation to sovereignty and compliance. The consequences were immediate and bloody. The state now claimed the right to regulate the soul, and the religious pendulum began to swing with murderous force. Henry's reforms were just the beginning. After his death, his daughter Mary I, a devout Catholic, seized the throne and sought to drag England back to Rome. Her methods were brutal. Earning the name Bloody Mary, she had hundreds of Protestants burned at the stake as heretics. The Oxford martyrs became a symbol of her reign's cruelty. When Mary died, her half-sister Elizabeth I took the throne and swung the pendulum back again, restoring Protestantism. But the machinery of persecution once built was too useful to dismantle. Elizabeth's government unleashed men like Richard Topcliffe, a professional torturer who took sadistic pleasure in hunting down Catholic priests. His methods were the stuff of nightmares, hanging, disemboweling, and quartering, all sanctioned by the state in the name of religious purity and national security. Your personal relationship with God was now a potential death sentence liable to change with each new monarch. The rot had infested the nation's very soul. We arrive at the final stage. When a society has been steeped in political anxiety, poisoned by its environment, failed by its healers, and terrorized by its spiritual guardians, the last pillar of civilization gives way: the law. The law ceases to be a shield for the innocent and becomes a weapon for the powerful and the paranoid. The social fabric, stretched thin by economic change and religious strife, was ripe for collective hysteria. The fear and uncertainty caused by radical shifts like the enclosure of common lands needed an outlet, a scapegoat. This erupted in the form of witch hunts. In towns like Warboys in England and across North Berwick in Scotland, mass panic led to formal trials where men and women were accused of impossible crimes, flying on broomsticks, consorting with the devil, changing shape into animals. These were not lynch mobs, they were state-sanctioned proceedings. The courts listened to spectral evidence and coerced confessions, then solemnly sentenced dozens to be hanged or burned. This was madness given the full authority and legitimacy of the law. And what is the Treason Act of 1534 if not the same logic elevated from a village green to the highest court in the land? It was the final horrifying synthesis of all the kingdom's poisons. The state, having already asserted control over the body and soul, now made its ultimate claim ownership of the mind. The act was a masterpiece of legal terror. It made it a capital offense to maliciously wish will or desire by words or writing any harm to the king or his heir, or to call him a heretic. The key words were wish and desire. The crime was no longer an action. The crime was a thought. A careless word in a tavern, a critical letter to a friend, even a refusal to speak, as in the case of Sir Thomas More, could be interpreted as a malicious desire. The burden of proof was reversed. You were assumed to be thinking treason unless you could prove otherwise. The victims of this new law were not foreign spies or armed rebels. They were men of conscience like Bishop John Fisher and Sir Thomas More, who were executed for their silence. They were inconvenient wives like Anne Boleyn, whose alleged adultery was reframed as treason. And in the ultimate act of systemic self-consumption, the law devoured its own architect, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had helped draft it. This was the final destination. A journey that began with the rational trade of a princess for a treaty had descended step by logical step into a world where your environment was poisoned. Your doctors were killers, your faith was a political liability, and your own thoughts could lead you to the executioner's block. The sickness was no longer just in the kingdom. The sickness was the kingdom. Every system built on fear eventually needs a sacrifice. The story of Thomas Cromwell is not just the tragedy of one man. It is a clinical demonstration of how a paranoid state, once perfected, will inevitably turn on its own architects. He was the man who built the machine, a master fixer who believed in the brutal logic of power. He never imagined that the machine's final, most logical act would be to consume him. To understand Cromwell's fall, you must first appreciate the sheer scale of his ascent. He was a phantom, a man who emerged from the smoke and grime of a blacksmith's forge in Putney to become the second most powerful man in England. He was not a nobleman. He did not have land or titles. He had something far more valuable in the cutthroat world of the Tudor court: a brilliant, ruthless mind and a complete absence of sentimentality. He was the architect of Henry VIII's will. When the king wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, it was Cromwell who navigated the legal and theological labyrinth to make it happen. When the Pope stood in the way, it was Cromwell who engineered the break, with Rome shattering 1,000 years of religious tradition and making his king the supreme head of the Church of England. When the crown needed money, it was Cromwell who orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries, a move of breathtaking audacity that transferred a quarter of the nation's wealth into the royal coffers. He was the man who put Anne Boleyn on the throne, and when she failed to produce a son, helped send her to the block. He was not loved. He was feared, respected, and ruthlessly efficient. He was the human engine of the Henrician Reformation. But in 1539, Cromwell faced his greatest challenge. The kingdom was on a knife's edge. The religious turmoil he had unleashed, which we saw simmering in Part 2, had split the country into warring factions. The old Catholic nobility, led by the powerful Duke of Norfolk, despised him as a low-born heretic. The radical Protestants felt he hadn't gone far enough, and on the throne sat Henry, a grieving, aging, and increasingly unpredictable king left widowed by the death of his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour. England was isolated, a rogue Protestant state in a sea of Catholic enemies. Cromwell, the master strategist, saw a solution. It was a move of pure political genius, a single stroke that would solve everything. He would arrange a marriage for Henry with a German princess, Anne of Cleves. This wasn't about romance, it was about survival. The marriage would forge a Protestant super-alliance, a bloc of German princes, and the English crown standing united against the Catholic might of France and the Holy Roman Empire. It was the capstone to his life's work, the move that would secure the Reformation, the Tudor dynasty, and his own position forever. This was his ultimate gamble. He presented the plan to the king with his signature unshakable confidence. He had reports, diplomatic dispatches, and crucially, a portrait. A stunningly beautiful portrait by the court painter Hans Holbein the Younger, depicting a serene and lovely princess. The king, intrigued by the political logic and captivated by the painted face, agreed. The deal was struck. The princess set sail for England, and Cromwell stood at the pinnacle of his power, unaware he was standing on a trapdoor. The first meeting between Henry VIII and his German bride is one of history's most catastrophic blind dates. Henry, filled with romantic expectation, disguised himself and surprised Anne at her residence in Rochester, hoping for a fairy tale moment of courtly love. What he got was a crushing disappointment. The woman before him, he later raged, looked nothing like the Holbein portrait. She was tall, strong-featured, and possessed none of the delicate courtly graces he expected. She spoke no English, only her native German. The cultural and physical chasm was immediate and absolute. Henry's vanity, a force of nature as powerful as any army, was deeply wounded. The famous royal verdict was delivered with brutal finality. I like her not. In a healthy political system, a king's romantic disappointment would be an embarrassing diplomatic wrinkle. But in the toxic, paranoid environment of Tudor England, a world already steeped in fear of poison, heresy, and betrayal, a king's bruised ego was a national security crisis. The grand Protestant alliance, the entire strategic foundation for the marriage, dissolved overnight. All that was left was Henry's profound personal humiliation. He felt he had been duped, tricked by his chief minister into marrying a woman he privately called the Flanders mare. The wolves began to circle. The Duke of Norfolk and the conservative faction, who had been waiting for years to destroy the blacksmith's son, saw their moment. They were the embodiment of the religious and aristocratic resentment that had been simmering for a decade. They had the king's ear, and they began to whisper poison into it. This wasn't a mistake, they hissed. This was a conspiracy. Cromwell, they argued, had deliberately deceived the king. He had ensnared him in this hideous marriage to advance his own radical Protestant agenda, to fill the court with heretics, to undermine the true faith. In a court where religious identity was already a matter of life and death, this accusation was lethal. They were not just attacking Cromwell's competence, they were attacking his soul, painting him as a traitor to both his king and his God. A sensible person, seeing the king's incandescent fury and the sharks circling in the water, would pivot here. They would grovel, find a new scapegoat, burn an underling, anything to redirect the royal rage. Cromwell did not. He was to the very end a man of systems and logic. He believed his decades of unwavering loyalty would count for something. He believed the political necessity of the alliance, however flawed, was self-evident. He believed that reason could overcome a monarch's tantrum. He fatally miscalculated. He had forgotten the primary lesson of the kingdom he had helped create in a world where the law has been weaponized to serve the monarch's will. Reason is the first casualty. The end came with the swift, impersonal efficiency that Cromwell himself had championed. On the 10th of June 1540, as the Privy Council was in session, the captain of the guard entered the chamber, strode up to the most powerful man in the kingdom, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "My Lord of Essex," he said, "I arrest you of high treason." The shock was absolute. Cromwell, the great political survivor, was stunned. He threw his cap to the ground in fury, demanding to know his accusers and his crime. But it was theater. He knew better than anyone how this worked. The charges were a formality, treason, and heresy. The evidence was a tapestry of rumors, innuendo, and the king's displeasure. There would be no trial. A trial would be an inconvenience, a stage for Cromwell to deploy his formidable intellect and legal knowledge. Instead, his enemies used a tool that Cromwell himself had perfected and used against countless others, an Act of Attainder. It was a simple piece of parliamentary legislation that declared a man guilty without the need for evidence or a defense. It was the ultimate legal shortcut, a guillotine made of parchment. The system he had built to serve the king's justice was now turned upon him with perfect, horrifying precision. From his cell in the Tower of London, the cold, calculating fixer finally broke. His letters to the king are a portrait of terror and desperation. The man who had faced down the Pope and humbled the ancient nobility was reduced to a pleading wreck. "Most gracious prince," he wrote his elegant script shaky, "I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." There would be no mercy. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led to the scaffold on Tower Hill. It was the same day that King Henry VIII married his fifth wife, the young and beautiful Catherine Howard, the niece of Cromwell's arch-nemesis, the Duke of Norfolk. The victory of the conservative faction was complete, sealed with both a wedding and an execution. Even Cromwell's death was a final grim irony. The executioner was notoriously clumsy, a drunkard who botched the job horribly, taking multiple swings of the axe. The man who had brought such cold bureaucratic efficiency to the English state was granted none of it in his own final moments. He was the master builder who designed a perfect prison only to find himself locked in the deepest cell. He had helped create the toxic, paranoid world where a king's whim was law and a dissenting thought was treason. He had fed the beast of absolute power, and in the end, the beast, still hungry, turned and devoured him. His fall was not an accident. It was the system working exactly as designed. The executioner's axe falls, and the crowd disperses. A life is over. But to understand the true killer, we must leave the blood-soaked scaffold and enter the chamber. This is the archive, the silent, dusty room where the blueprints for the madness were drafted and perfected. It is time to open the case file and begin the autopsy. The official story, the one written by the victors and taught for centuries, is a simple, sensible tale of national security. The Treason Act of 1534 they claimed was a necessary shield. In a dangerous age of international intrigue and religious war, the king needed a tool to protect the realm from papal agents, foreign assassins, and domestic traitors who sought to plunge the kingdom back into chaos. It was a measure of defense, not oppression, a regrettable but essential piece of statecraft. But the evidence in this chamber tells a different story. The exhibits do not speak of security. They speak of a system. Our first exhibit is the instrument of the curse itself, the text of the Treason Act. Read the words and you will see, this is no ordinary law. It does not merely criminalize actions. It goes further. It prosecutes intent. The law condemns anyone who would maliciously wish, will, or desire by words or writing to harm the king. Wish, will, or desire. This is a breathtaking piece of legal engineering. For the first time, the law did not stop at the boundary of a citizen's body. It crossed over and invaded the private territory of the mind. It placed the soul under state surveillance. A joke told in a tavern, a prayer whispered in private, a moment of frustrated silence, any of these could be interpreted by a hostile witness or a paranoid official as a malicious desire. The act didn't require proof of a plot. It only required the accusation of a thought. This was not a shield, it was a scalpel. It was a surgical tool designed to dissect a person's loyalty, to root out any trace of dissent before it could ever grow into an action. It was the final legal expression of the paranoia we saw reach its boiling point, transforming the very act of thinking into a potential state crime. But a law this extreme cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires a society already primed for suspicion, a world where every neighbor is a potential threat. For that, we turn to the forensic evidence of the era. As we saw in the warming waters of the Tudor world, the kingdom was steeped in a literal and metaphorical poison arsenic. The infamous case of Sir Thomas Overbury's murder in 1613 is the most famous example, but it was merely the tip of the iceberg. Court records and personal diaries from the period are rife with the fear of being poisoned. Arsenic, the cheap and readily available rat killer, was the weapon of choice for settling scores, eliminating rivals, and hastening inheritances. It was a silent, intimate terror that haunted the banquet halls of the great and the kitchen tables of the common. This constant low-level fear of physical poison created the perfect psychological breeding ground for a law that targeted ideological poison. When you genuinely believe the person sitting next to you might slip arsenic into your wine, it is a very small leap to believing that their mind harbors treasonous thoughts. The Treason Act was a symptom of a sickness that was already present. It fed on the pre-existing paranoia that permeated every level of Tudor society, a world where the fear of a sudden, inexplicable death was a part of daily life. Fear of physical poison was potent, but it was the fear of spiritual poison heresy that became the true engine of the state's cruelty. Our final exhibit is a ledger written in faith and fire, showing how the crime of treason became inseparable from the sin of unorthodox belief. As we saw, the religious landscape was a battlefield. Under the Catholic Queen, Bloody Mary, to be a Protestant was to be a heretic and therefore a traitor to God and his anointed queen. Hundreds were burned at the stake, but the machinery of persecution was bipartisan. When the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I took the throne, the targets changed, but the methods escalated. Elizabeth's government sanctioned men like Richard Topcliffe, a figure of pure, methodical evil, who held the official title of pursuivant, a professional priest-hunter. His own accounts, written with chilling pride, detail his methods of torture designed to extract confessions from Catholics. He was not just an executioner. He was an inquisitor, a specialist in breaking the body to purify the soul. The men he hunted were charged with treason, but their true crime was their faith. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered not for plotting against the Queen's life, but for celebrating a Latin Mass. This is the crucial point. Treason had become a floating, convenient label for whatever ideology the monarch deemed a threat. The law was no longer about protecting the king's body, but about enforcing the king's conscience upon the entire nation. So what was the true mechanism at the heart of this cursed chamber? It wasn't just one king's anger or one flawed law. It was a perfect storm, a confluence of the societal poisons we dissected. A nation physically unsettled by plague and progress, psychologically tormented by religious schism and living in constant fear of poison and betrayal. And that brings us to the final chilling verdict. The curse of Tudor England was not witchcraft, nor was it divine wrath. It was the paranoia of an absolute monarch, amplified and weaponized by a legal system that turned fear into the currency of control. The Treason Act was the algorithm that made this system run. It wasn't a defensive wall, it was an offensive weapon. It gave the state a license to hunt not for criminals, but for nonconformists. It empowered a paranoid regime to silence its critics, eliminate its rivals, and enforce absolute obedience, not just on its subjects' bodies, but on the last free territory they possessed, their own minds. Step out of the chamber, leave the scent of old parchment and cold fear behind. The axe has fallen, the ink has dried, and the Tudors are dust. But the systems they designed do not die so easily. What is the echo that follows us out of their world and into our own? The verdict then is this: the most lethal curse of the Tudor age was not a poison, a plague, or a witch's hex. It was a formula, a political equation where the boundless paranoia of a monarch was multiplied by a legal system that transformed fear into a weapon of the state. Thomas Cromwell was not the disease. He was a master surgeon who perfected a procedure so effective that the state in its fever demanded his own dissection. He did not die because his system failed. He died because it succeeded beyond anyone's darkest imagination, proving that in a kingdom built on suspicion, no one is safe, especially not the architect. It is tempting to shelve this story under ancient history and move on. Do not. Nothing in that mechanism is truly antique. The ghost of the Treason Act of 1534 never vanished. It merely learned to wear modern clothing. The precedent it set, that a state has the right to legislate and prosecute the inner thoughts of its citizens, has echoed through the centuries. It echoes in every sedition law that blurs the line between dissent and treason. It echoes in every loyalty oath that demands a pledge not just of action, but of belief. It haunts every modern debate we have about national security versus personal liberty, about the state's right to surveil its people for their own protection. The Tudors pioneered the concept that for the state to be truly secure, the mind of the individual could not be truly free. That terrifying idea did not die with them. They wrote the source code for state-sponsored paranoia, and it has been ported, updated, and redeployed ever since. History, in the end, is a logbook of plausible mistakes made with perfect confidence. The men who built the Tudor machine, Henry Cromwell and the rest, did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as pragmatists, as patriots. In their own minds, they were the saviors of a kingdom beset by heresy from within and enemies from without. They believed their brutality was the necessary, regrettable price of order and stability. They were convinced they were saving the soul of England, even as they were meticulously poisoning it with fear, suspicion, and the legalization of madness. They were like so many powerful figures after them, entirely sincere in their justifications for the unforgivable. So what is your verdict? Is a state ever justified in policing the thoughts of its citizens to ensure stability, or is that the moment the state itself becomes the greatest threat? Leave your judgment in the comments below. And if you wish to unlock more of history's cursed chambers and continue this autopsy of power, subscribe and ring the bell of execution or notification. The choice for now is still yours.